Hey guys, and welcome to the show. So in our previous video we created our Node.js server. It didn't really do much other than creating a database and connecting to that database, creating our player table, and then we made sure that actually the table existed and that we could push data into it. As you can see, this is exactly where we left off. Again, if you would like the notes for this video, hop onto my Patreon channel and you can find them right over there. They actually have everything for this entire backend portion, wrapper if you will, of this series. So if you look at that right now, you can actually get a bit of a head start for part 3, or you can even follow along with my notes on this video tutorial series. Now, it was a little bit lame and inconvenient to have to insert data using the command line for SQLite 3. Obviously, our game is not going to be doing it like that. That was just to demonstrate that everything was, together and existing. So in this video, we're actually going to be starting to create our 5 endpoints: our get by ID, our post, our put, and our delete. We're going to start with the post because obviously we want to push data into our database, which then we'll use to get all or get by ID, and then we can do the delete again, not needing then to fiddle too much with the SQLite 3 command line toolset. Even though that is quite powerful, that's not the focus of this video. I'm going to create some space between kind of setting up our resources over here and creating our server at the bottom. And let's start off with our post. Now again, we're following along with a tutorial that I actually found here on Tutorials Point. This you need to read. It's fantastic. It shows you how you can do all the stuff we're going to be demonstrating, especially in Node.js. So example, here's like the get by ID, and there's the delete and so on, and they go through the whole lot. So I've just compressed all of this into this video format. Credits do go out to Tutorials Point for creating this very well structured document. It really got me up to speed because again, I haven't done this in Node.js before, so this is all I really needed to understand and actually create this series for you guys. So do check out that link in the description. So here we're going to say app.post, and we're going to be creating an endpoint that is /players, and then we're going to be taking in a request and a response. Okay, cool. So there it says there's your request and here's your response, and there's our function notation. We can put a semicolon up there. Do you need a semicolon over here? Probably just put it in. Then over here, now I'm going to be using let to create this variable, and I'll tell you why just now. Insert into player. Okay, so this is the post, which remember post means put into. If you don't understand the post, put, get, delete, request, then check out my other HTTP video. We actually do things through GameMaker for that one, and I touch all of the verbs in that series. And you can come back here and you'll better understand what all of this is about. This is name sprite. Now we don't supply the ID because, as we saw earlier, the ID is an auto increment primary key, so that's going to be created by SQLite itself. And then we need to stipulate the values with 2 question marks, just like that. Okay, so now remember it's expecting 2 params. Remember that, 2 params, 1 for name, 1 for sprite. And we can do some SQL indentation over here. Lovely. And don't forget about your semicolon over there. And again, we're going to say let because I'll show you we're going to be actually altering and updating these a little bit later. Params equals an array, because remember, where was it? Over here, we needed an array, right? So our SQL goes into the first argument, and then an array of params to apply to that SQL go into the second. So this one, to create our table, we didn't need any params to go in, so we just passed in the empty array. But in this case, we want 2 items from our request: req.body.name and req.body.name. sprite. Now remember when we said express is to pass the request coming through as JSON? Well, with these requests there's going to be a JSON body, and that JSON body is going to have a name and a sprite. So when the player opens up the game on the device of their choosing, they select a really cool sprite, and then they put in their name and they say start, and that's going to send a request to this post, which is then going to extract the name and extract the sprite in order to do the insert into our database. Okay, don't forget the semicolon over there. And again, as we did db over here, db run, we do the same thing. We say db.run, and we say this is the SQL to execute, these are your params, and if you have an error, you want to grab that into this property over here. Is there anything else in here? Let me just check. This is really good at actually providing intelligence. Callback, error, okay, so it's just that. Oh wait, there are other ones. SQL string callback, that's all part of this then. Params, callback, and then here you've got params. Okay, so we're actually using the one that has SQL, params, and then this is the callback function we're creating over here. And as before, we're saying if there's an error, then we can say console.error err.message. Clean that up. Else we don't have an error, which means that we must have inserted, or we must have executed that SQL, and the SQL was an insert. So let's console log, and here we can use backtick so we can interpolate the string, which again means just putting some values inside of a string without having to do like string manipulation. With your single quotes, you might have seen you have like a single quote, then you got to put plus, and then you have a variable name, and then you do another single quote, plus, you know, etc., which is quite laborious. So we just use backtick, so we can say added player with name, interpolate the request body name, and sprite, interpolate the sprite, just like that. Okie dokie. I can actually do a return over here because we don't want it to carry on if there's an error. So I'll show you what I want to do. That's better. So if there's an error, you know, console error that error, and then return out of this. Otherwise, you know, it must have succeeded. We don't need an else because it would have returned otherwise. And here is where I want to update that SQL that I sent through. Now I could have made this const, you know, SQL1, const SQL2. That seems a bit wasteful. Instead, we're just going to reuse that property, and I want to select the ID from player over there, and here I want to say where name equals question mark, like that, and we can say let params equals that guy. I'm not sure yet, I haven't actually dug deep enough into this, how to get the newly created resource out of this insert just automatically, because that would be so much easier than having to do a separate DB run inside of this one. But that's okay for now, we're just going to be doing it this way. Here we're going to say db.get. So notice that this is a db get and that's a db run. It's like an execute and a query. And here again, SQL, params. There's our error, and the reason why it's get is because we have this kind of response. I don't think this one had it, did it? Yeah, that's only expecting an error. So this one has the row coming back because of our get. It could be many rows. Okay, over there. And here we want to say, again, if error, that's going to be a recurring theme. Otherwise, we're going to say res.end row.id.to string, just like that. Okay. Res being the response over here, request response. So we consume the request, we build up a response, and we're saying that the response is actually the ID of the row coming back because of this select. Now, maybe in the future we need to kind of make this a little bit more resilient to duplicate names, or we can just make sure that names are unique. So for example, here we could say to do make player name unique. That does actually make sense. I want to make sure that people don't create a whole bunch of accounts with the same name, because we're going to be using that name perhaps later on. But for now, we won't make them unique, but we can think about maybe putting in a to-do to make the player name unique at a later stage. So we insert into that table, and if it's successful, we create another little SQL request over here, which then returns the ID of that player. Okay, let's get rid of the space for now. Let's save. Okay, let us go back to my other terminal. This is the node. See, the game's still running. All right, let's go and run that. See if there's any errors. No. Connected to GameDB. Listening on the port. Everything seems fine. Now the question is, how do we test this, right? Well, so I use Postman. It's really good for hitting endpoints. You know, your get by ID and your get, all you can do straight in the browser, but it's a little bit more difficult when it comes to like post and put and delete. So we're going to be using Postman. You can find Postman, just typing Postman into Google or whatever your search engine is. It'll come up at the top and you can download it. It's really fantastic, and you can even save collections of requests as you go along to kind of reuse them. And you can even do like Postman tests. So you send a request to an API you know, and you can say, I expect to get this type of information back. And if you don't get that information, you can flag that as something going wrong with your API. So I've got these requests already kind of predefined over here. We're going to be testing the post. So remember, in our server.js, we ensured that Express was going to be consuming JSON. If we go to our post over here, again, let's go and see how we're listening on. Why doesn't that come up? I think we typed something wrong in here. Okay, well, never mind about that for now. Let's just hard code in what it should be, which is localhost 8080. I'll look into why that wasn't doing anything a little bit later. There we go. Okay, so we're localhost 8080. So if we go back to Postman, we need to make sure that it says localhost 8080, and then the /players is because we want to hit this players endpoint. And if we take a closer look at that, there's nothing else going on here. We don't have any special headers. It's just our body that has name Bob99 and sprite SPR Adventurer 1. So if our server is running, and it is now, and we click send on this, we should firstly see our console log over here saying that it was added the player successfully, and then we should actually see the response coming back as, it should be 2, because earlier we did, in the previous video, we did the manual insertion through SQLite 3.exe. Okay, so let's go back to Postman and let's click run. We'll click send in this case. Okay, so it looks like it was successful. 200 okay, that's very good. 310 milliseconds, and we go to our body and you see here, there's a 2. That's the identifier that's being auto-generated by SQLite. It's saying, oh, this is the second row in that table. Now, if we delete rows, it'll still keep incrementing, so this isn't a count of the amount of items in that table. It's just a way to uniquely identify each one. So Bob99 will always be known as having ID 2 in player. If we have to select from the player table, always using ID 2, it'll always bring back Bob99. So that was a success, and if we go back here, it says they added player with name Bob99 and sprite SPR Adventurer 1. So this endpoint is consuming that request in JSON correctly, and it's inserting into the database, and the database is then returning the ID. So that is absolutely fantastic. Next up, let's create the get endpoint. So we can, always query the contents of our table a little bit easier than having to use SQLite command line. So again, we start with app being Express JS, and here we're going to say a get. This is going to be a get all. So our endpoint is also players. also have request response. That's always standard. And for a semicolon there. And inside here, we're going to use const because this is SQL that we're not going to need to change. Backticks to give us multi-line support. Select ID, comma name, comma sprite. Align that nicely. From player, semicolon, over there. I wonder if I need semicolons in here. I know I needed them for the command line. I haven't been using them up here, so perhaps we don't. Let's just do a test on that. Again, params equals blank in this case because we're not needing any params. And here we're going to say db.all. Oopsie, db.all. That's a new one. We haven't used db.all. So here we notice we've done db run to execute something we don't expect there to be a response for, or some sort of identifier coming back as. We use db get when we're getting a single row, as you see here, row, and we're going to say db all when we expect multiple rows. And as you guessed it probably, I hope, in our callback it says rows now, not row, rows, because it knows there could be multiple things. And we're going to go again, if error, console error. Otherwise, here we had res end to string. I'm going to copy that. But instead of saying res end with the toString of the ID, we have JSON.stringify rows. So rows is our response from our DB. We're going to turn that back into JSON, which is the same format that we received it in. Send that back to the caller. Let's save that. Let us stop our server and rerun. Didn't explode, that's good. So let's go to our get now. This is the next one we did. Over here, you can see our endpoint that we want to hit is again the player's endpoint on the server at localhost port 8080. If I click send, we should get a couple rows back. Well, in this case, a couple rows in JSON format. Can I make this look prettier? Pretty JSON. There you go. So there it is. We have ID1, Bobby, our SPR player 1. This is the guy we inserted manually using the SQLite.exe command line. And the second one is from our previous post. There's Bob99, ID2, SPR Adventurer 1. If we go back to our server, we shouldn't see any errors. And we can actually post all kinds of things. So Jerry could be number 2. Let's send that. It should say 3. Here we can say Amy, Adventurer 7. Send that. Here we can say Jim is Adventurer 3. Send that. And let's do Billy. He likes that sprite 8. And as we're adding users, if we go back to our get and we run that, we now should see, if I make this pretty, more data coming back. And each one of those requests should have logged added player with and then the data that was added to our database. So this stuff is actually right now existing in our database on the machine of the player who's playing your game, which is quite fantastic. And that'll keep growing, and we'll change it, editing, deleting things, updating as the game progresses, as the user interacts with your database. And that's always stored in GameDB, which is really fun about SQLite because it's local. It's local to where your application is. You don't have to connect it to some faraway server where it has to send information over the internet, and you don't have to deal with that massive delay time. This is all very local to the user's machine, or to the actual game folder that they're dealing with right there. And accessing all of this stuff is all managed by Node.js. Whenever we install this game on the client's machine, we're going to be making sure that the server can fire itself up, can run npm install to make sure it has all its packages and does run. So that's something, and that's a problem we'll solve later on, but I'm fairly confident that it'll actually be all right. Okay, so now that we've got the post, we've got the get all, let us go ahead and do the get by ID. Now the get by ID is very similar to this. So I'm actually going to copy the whole thing. I'm going to paste it down here. What we need to add is colon ID over here. So again, it's the players kind of controller, and we're going to pass it an identifier. And when it sees that there's like a players / integer, it's going to hit this one and not the get all. Okay, so what we need to change is ID name sprite from player where, and here we're going to say ID equals. Now, another cool thing I can show you. So do you remember earlier we did, name equals question mark, and then we used params and stuff. But you can go ahead and, because we're using backticks, we can interpolate inside here what we actually want, and then we could always just default params to blank. It is a thing. So I'm going to show you these two different ways, and you can decide which one you want to go for. So here I'm just going to say, let's do interpolation, which we've got req for request, params, not body, dot ID. So that's going to be the identifier coming through over there. And there we have params blank. We're going to say db get, because that's a single. Params is blank, error nodes, that's all great. And this is actually row, because remember get was just a row. Do we have a get here? There, it's just a row, and that changes to stringify the single row. So let's save that, let's make that look neat, and that's ID. Let's stop that, restart our server. So remember we had all kinds of identifiers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we can use any of those to bring back data. So if we go to our get by ID request over here, you'll see nothing. This is all blank. The only thing we've got here is players / and we can say 4, for example. So we're expecting when we say 4 to get back Amy with SPR Adventurer 7, all right? So if we do 4, we say send. There we go. Let's make this look pretty. ID 4, name Amy, sprite adventurer 7. So if we do 1, we should get that very first user we inserted manually, Bobby with SPR player 1, etc, etc, and you can keep getting data. Now what happens if we pass through something that doesn't exist? Let's try 9. Send that through. Okay, so it returns 200 okay. It's not saying there's any problems, but you can see there's nothing coming back. So we could always handle this a bit better, return of status code that is probably more appropriate. That's something we can deal with at a later stage. But for now, as you see, it's not getting data that doesn't exist. Now, before we wrap up this video, let's do one more. Let us actually do the delete. So it's very similar to the get. We have to say we want to hit this endpoint. We want to pass in an ID. We also have some SQL. We're going to be using the interpolation version instead of the array params. So here what I want to say is delete, and we're going to say from player, and here we can use the ID, where ID equals request params ID, and got our blank params, and here we're going to say db run, because we're not expecting there to be anything coming back. SQL params, this is our error, and we can grab that. If there's an error, print it to the console. Otherwise, by this point in time, we can console log that we have deleted player with ID, and then this is request params ID, just like that. And don't forget to do res end to tell Express that this is the end. It can return to the caller, and we're not returning any information. Okay, so that should be the delete. And how we test this is, well, remember that collection of wonderful users we had, or players? We can go to our delete and we can start deleting them. So let's go to our get all. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We can then, let's go and delete this guy because he's kind of using the wrong standard for the sprite name anyway. I think we're going to be using adventurer. That sounds fantastic. So we're going to go and pass through a 1 over here. Let's send. There we go, 200 okay. If we go back to the get all, now remember there's a 1 here. If I send it to do another request, we should end up with nothing over here. And send. Okay, let's look at this as JSON. There we go. ID1 no longer exists. He has been deleted. And you can go and you can delete as much as you want. So if in your game the user wants to delete and start a new game, this is how you can possibly do that. You can remove that data from the database so it doesn't get too big just sitting there. There we go. We do another one, and another one is gone. So that's as far as we're going to be going for this video. We've done the get, or the get by ID, and the delete. That's, I think, what we need to build upon our game. So in the next video, we're actually going into GameMaker. We're going to be creating some sort of little game where we select a player sprite, we put in a name, and we'll send this data to our database. And then we can kind of query it to make sure it's there. So later on we'll explore the put, maybe something changes, player wants to change his sprite or his name, but that can come at a later stage. So thanks for watching this video. Hope you found it educational and helpful. The project files are in the description. There's also the notes. You can follow along on my Patreon. Please check that out. I do appreciate your support. Also in the description, I've got a Dogecoin address if you want to get rid of some of your dog coins. That would be fun. Send them right over there. I do appreciate the support. So until next time, happy coding, and I'll see you then.